This is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more particularly from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. And I want to welcome you. I hope you're having a lovely day. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your question or comment into whatever platform that you happen to be watching the program on. It will show up here in my chat room and we can talk directly. And my subject today is dragons and stuff. And I thought I would continue a little bit of our discussion of dragons from yesterday. We were focusing on the advent of the Greenwood Dragon Lunar New Year yesterday. But today I want to talk more about dragons as such. We did do a little of that yesterday. And I thought also I might speak about some other animals from mythology, such as perhaps the Sphinx, about which there are some interesting things we could say, or anything you might like to ask about. And I'm wearing green today uh, as a tribute to some of our dragon friends, and particularly the green wood dragon. And that, I guess, is where we're going to start. So, yesterday we talked about how, and hello to Christine in the chat room. It's good to see you, Christine. About how dragons are seen historically very differently in Asia versus Europe. In Asia, dragons, and hello to Janet in the chat room. In Asia, dragons have usually been a very positive symbol. They have often been guardians and wise advisors, and often associated with sacred places and prosperity and auspicious omens. And hello to Nikki in the chat room. So in Asia, dragons are thought of in very positive terms. And when we look at their meaning in the Asian horoscope, it's a very positive meaning. And hello to Antonio in the chat room. It's good to see you, Antonio. Uh, in the West, until fairly recently, this was not necessarily true. In the West, dragons were usually thought of in more negative terms. And this goes way, way back historically. The earliest dragon I can think of in Western mythology is Tiamat in Mesopotamian astrology. And Tiamat was the mother goddess, but she was also associated with the idea of chaos. And if you've read chapter 2 of my degree lessons, you'll understand why that is. Chaos is the first creation, it is the beginning of things. And it's natural that this would be associated with the mother goddess and the origin of things. But in our very ordered world, we often have a fear of chaos, and particularly a fear of going back to it. Now, when we talk about things like the chaos moment and chaos magic, we see that that is not a logical fear, but it is a fear that you often find motivating human thought patterns. So, in Mesopotamian religion, the god Marduk fought the mother goddess Tiamat and ended up dividing her dead body into the created world as we know it, which is another way of saying the god emerged from the goddess and created the physical world, just as we see in the Vangelo delle Streghe. The goddess is the essence behind it, the substance of it. The god is the order and cycles which take place within it. Right there in the story of Marduk and Tiamat, we can find that symbolism. But Tiamat was portrayed as a dragon. And almost all mythology about dragons in the Western world thereafter replicated this theme to some extent. We see in Egyptian mythology, the god Ra, during the course of his nightly travels, every night would battle Apep. Now, Apep was not a dragon in quite the way we normally think of. Apep was the great cobra, the great serpent, who represented chaos, but a dragon for the purpose of this conversation. In Greek mythology, there are a number of times that heroes battle dragons or similar things, again, establishing the supremacy of order and civilization over chaos. This is the underlying theme of that particular mythology. When we look to the Middle Ages, The Greek heroes are replaced with Christian saints. The story of Saint George and the dragon is still the story of Perseus and the dragon, which is still the story of Tiamat and Marduk when we really come down to it. And that's what the Western world had for dragons for a very long time. But that has changed today. And today, many people in the Western world work with dragons in a very positive sense and see them entirely differently than that particular interpretation. They perceive dragons not exactly in the same way as Asian culture has perceived dragons, but much closer to it. They perceive the dragons as, um, generally speaking, a kind of spirit who acts to them as a spirit guide or guardian, and is, when approached correctly, beneficial and helpful, but still can be quite um, frightening, quite overpowering when not approached correctly. And hello to Brenda in the chat room. It's good to see you, Brenda. And Brenda is going to be our guest for an interview on next Tuesday, 1 week from today. And I'm looking forward to that. We'll be talking about the upcoming Corellian lustration. And if you're not already registered for lustration, I would encourage you to do so. It's going to be quite a historic event. But I'm not expecting to have any dragons there. Um, and Brenda says, thank you. Thank you, Brenda. But getting back to dragons, many people today in the Western world um, consciously interact with spiritual dragons, which present themselves as dragons, and they work with them in particular forms of magic, such as dragon magic, which have their own particular customs, their own way of doing things. And there are a number of books you can get on this subject if dragons are something that speaks to you. Now, if you ask me, are these actual dragons, which were perceived historically and perhaps misunderstood and simply happen to be in spirit form? Well, maybe they are. Or maybe they show themselves with this image because it speaks to people. My experience with spirit guides is that they can show themselves however they choose to show themselves. And my own spirit guides normally appear as people, but on occasion they would choose other forms. So my attitude is trust your own experience and make your own decision on things like that. Hello to Tom in the chat room. Are they actually dragons? I see no reason not to take them that way. But in the end, they're spirits, which means that they don't have a physical form. They're energy. I saw someone's meme the other day saying that um, spirit does not speak English; it speaks frequency, and this is absolutely true. Spirit does not communicate with what we understand as language. It communicates through concept, through knowing and telepathy, for want of a better way to put it. So, when someone says, well, Latin is the language of the gods, well, no, energy is the language of the gods. And the same for any other language that anyone would like to see that way. I'm sorry, they're our languages. Spirit speaks through energy. And this is also true of the images of spirit. So, um, if your spirit guide comes to you, let's say that your spirit guide is your departed great uncle. You'll see them as they looked in life, but where they are now, they're energy. But they will use the familiar face so that you will understand it's them. If your spirit guide is a dragon, that may speak to the nature of their energy, but it's not a physical form. Their form is energetic. Um, Now, that doesn't mean it isn't still specifically of draconic form, but in the end, it's energetic, and this is always true. And hello to Steve in the chat room. It's good to see you, Steve. But dragons are very popular today, and again, they've come to be seen very differently. I think a lot of that came through the fantasy genre, where dragons came to be perceived first as misunderstood underdogs, and then later as quite sympathetic characters. and it changed how people relate to them. And I think that's a very beneficial change. And hello to Judy in the chat room. It's good to see you, Judy. Um, and I said that I would also talk about some other metaphysical creatures today. Um, I thought I would talk a little bit also about the Sphinx. And of course, unless you have lived under a rock, you are familiar, I'm sure, with the Great Sphinx in Egypt. But it's certainly only one of thousands of Egyptian images of the Sphinx. And the Sphinx in Egypt is a lion with the head of a human or some other animal. And hello to Renee in the chat room. In early Egypt, lions were very, very sacred. They always remain sacred in Egypt. Um, and in like the first dynasty of Egypt, you see a lot of images of recumbent lions. Later, it became the custom to use the body of the lion with a different head, commonly the head of the reigning pharaoh, um, also sometimes heads associated with certain gods. For example, at the temple of Amun in Luxor, you will see the Avenue of Sphinxes, where the Sphinxes have the head of a ram on the body of a lion. And this was associated with the god Amun. Um, you'll sometimes see Sphinxes with the head of a falcon, which is either Ra or Horus. Um, so the Sphinx had a number of different formats that you might see it, but most commonly it was a human head. It was a way of expressing the strength of spiritual power of whatever it represented. There is a theory that the Great Sphinx at Giza was originally the sculpture of a recumbent lion, um, and the head was later resculpted to be the head of um, a particular pharaoh. One of the reasons that's thought is that the head is not in proportion to the rest of the monument and also appears to be in somewhat better condition, indicating it may have come later. I find that a fairly convincing argument as opposed to a number of arguments about the Sphinx that I don't find equally convincing. But the Sphinx is certainly one of the greatest monuments of ancient Egypt that survives. But we also see the Sphinx in Mediterranean culture east of Egypt, where it commonly is the body of a lion with a bird's head, or occasionally, as we get a little later in history, a woman's head in Greece. The Sphinx becomes something very different from what it was in Egypt, and it has the head and bosom of a woman and the wings of an eagle. And this seems to have come through Mycenaean culture, where you see the Sphinx with the head of a bird and the wings of a bird. Um, and here the Sphinx becomes one of those monsters of chaos that one of the great Greek heroes overcomes, and is associated with the famous riddle, um, what goes on four legs at dawn, two legs at midday, and three legs at sunset. And um, it speaks to how one symbol can start in one place and spread out and change as different peoples adapt it. Um, the Sphinx is not especially common as a symbol today, not especially uncommon either, but usually in its Egyptian form. Occasionally its Greek form. But in the ancient world, it was a far more common figure, and you do sometimes see it show up in fantasy novels, for example. And hello to Jeanette in the chat room. It's good to see you, Jeanette. The Sphinx has, again, many different forms, and um, most commonly, if you see it today, you'll see it in the original Egyptian form, and with that original Egyptian purpose to represent the spiritual strength of whatever it is depicting. Some other metaphysical creatures you might see, if you've read the Harry Potter books, you'll be familiar with the idea of the basilisk. Uh, but if you watched the movie, you won't exactly know how the basilisk was traditionally portrayed. The basilisk was a a serious figure in Western occult history, but it was not um, a giant serpent as such. The basilisk was a mixture between um, a serpent, and in some cases more of a serpent, but also a rooster. And this makes for a very interesting looking creature. And as in the Harry Potter stories, um, it was known for turning people to stone. You don't really hear a lot about the basilisk today, but in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, you saw it show up a lot more common um, in people's symbolism in the bestiaries of the period. Probably one of the most interesting things to show up, uh, n- not really in occult bestiaries, but on the range of mythical animals was the vegetable sheep. And the vegetable sheep is very interesting because it actually is a real thing, very vastly misunderstood by many of our ancestors. If you look in the bestiaries of the medieval period, the vegetable sheep was a sheep that was planted as a seed and grew up as a plant and took the form of a sheep. And you'll see illustrations of the sheep with its root coming from its navel going down into the earth because it's a plant. And obviously, no such thing existed, but what it was a misunderstanding of the cotton plant. Um, they understood that there was a plant that produced wool not unlike a sheep, and they totally misunderstood what it was. But knowing what it was, it's very interesting to see how people interpreted it. I was talking yesterday about the griffin, which again shows up in those Harry Potter books and also very heavily in heraldry and a number of other places, um, with the head and wings of a bird, the body of a lion. Um, and the griffin is thought to have been a misunderstanding of the bones of, I believe, a triceratops in what is now Scythia, or what was then Scythia, um, and the region between there and Greece. They had found some of these skeletons, and apparently this is what they thought they had been, and they took it as proof that their mythological monsters had actually existed. And in at least a few cases, they reburied them, um, making clear what they thought they were. And whether the mythological monster or creature comes before the discovery of the skeleton or vice versa is a bit of um, a question we certainly don't have an answer to, and probably could never have an answer to. But it's interesting to see the different way people interpreted these things when they had a different worldview and a more limited frame of reference. I also mentioned how the Cyclops, which you find in the Odyssey, is thought to have arisen from finding the bones of prehistoric elephants in the Mediterranean area and not understanding what they were. Because if you look at the skull of an elephant, it has a big round central cavity, which appears to be an eye socket if you don't know what it really was, which was where the trunk attached. And these have been found reburied and labeled as Cyclops. And it's assumed that this was presumably where they got the idea that such a thing had once existed, certainly where they got a firm belief that it had once existed. And when we look at this historically, again, it's very interesting to see how this informed ancient people's ideas of what was and was not real. It was very hard to deny the existence of Cyclops when you had found the skeleton of of a Cyclops, much larger than a human, much thicker bones than a human, and with a single large eye socket. Um, the only thing was, if you had known what an elephant was and what its skeleton looked like, you'd have known that it was not a Cyclops. But they didn't know that at that time. This gives you a somewhat different view of how they saw the world versus if you did not know that. The same with the griffin, and undoubtedly many other things. Prehistoric remains are not something we just discovered, but they are something that we only recently began to analyze analytically from a naturalistic point of view. One of the things I find, one of my most interesting books, not in certainly the way that it's written, but in what's inside it, is called Curion. And it's the history of a particular city and the archaeological discovery and excavation of that city. And it makes a number of interesting points. Um, I think this comes from that book, but it speaks about the ancient shrine in that area and how it contained things that even in that day were very ancient that had been made as offerings. You see this also in Egypt, where, for example, one of the great temples of Thoth had ancient fossils which had been made as offerings to the god of knowledge. And did they know what these things were? Well, they obviously had some idea that they were something special and considered them somewhat sacred. And we today rarely are aware that they even understood these things were there, let alone how they interacted with them. If you've never read the book Curian and you're interested in archaeology, I highly recommend it. It also points out um, the number of unanswered questions that exist in archaeology. For example, in the city of Curian, they found examples of lace making kits far earlier than any example of lace exists. They're not quite sure what they were used for. The thought is they were probably used for making netting rather than what we think of as lace. But the technology far predated um, the historical, um, the places where the existence of lace and lace making is noted in written sources or was otherwise known. Obviously, if you find that that technology, they must have had it, but there's no record that they were doing it. And they weren't necessarily doing quite the same thing with it. But it's interesting to know that that the technique of making what would later be bobbin lace goes back into antiquity. And even if we don't quite know what they did with it, um, I believe there's also an example from Pompeii of what certainly appears to be a pasta maker, very similar to a modern one. Um, and yet we were not particularly aware of their doing that. Nor are we certain that's exactly what it was, but it surely looks like it. But um, the book Curion also talks about how you can find very anomalous things in an archaeological dig, like bread wrappers, for example. And that doesn't mean that there were bread wrappers thousands of years ago with modern brands on them. It means that various burrowing animals had grabbed them for whatever reason and burrowed deep into the earth with them, and that's how they were found there. And this is a very interesting thing to consider if you're very interested in archaeology and the many unusual questions that there are in archaeology. And hello to Lepos Felix in the chat room. Good to see you. I find archaeology a fascinating thing, always have. And as I was saying, I think just yesterday, I'm not a great fan in the ancient aliens did everything school of thought because it seems to me the archaeological record is pretty clear on a lot of things. If anything, new archaeological finds only suggest that our ancestors were um, more highly developed earlier than we thought they were, not necessarily in need of external influence to do great things. Which does not mean that I believe that there are no extraterrestrial life forms or that we necessarily have not had connection with them. Many people I have known, myself included, have had spiritual experiences. Um, with what we would loosely call aliens. But that does not make me any fonder of the work of Eric von Daniken. And Lepus Felix says, remember the tree trunks stuck in layers of stone? Absolutely. Things show up in ways you don't expect. And sometimes we can only extrapolate what that means, but I think we need to be cautious in what we extrapolate. One of the famous examples of unanswered questions of archaeology is the spark plug found buried in ancient layers of stone, um, and how this proves that far more advanced people must have been there than we give credit for. But the only problem with that is the spark plug came specifically from 1925, which doesn't make a lot of sense for ancient aliens. And there's a real question, since the artifact itself has long been missing, whether it was actually stone at all, or merely hardened mud. Um, so we must be, I think, kind of cautious in how easily we accept some of these tales, because if you look at them a little closer, they don't always follow through. Um, that does not necessarily mean that it's not worth thinking about, but I think we have to be cautious in the conclusions that we use. Another famous one are the supposed light bulbs in the Temple of Dendera. There is a famous bas relief showing what many people think are light bulbs from the ancient world. The only problem with this is there is a vast amount of text connected to this illustration, which makes extremely clear exactly what's going on in this picture. And it is a symbolic representation of um, the act of divine birth, and very clear on what it's representing. But nobody ever seems to want to read that. And Lepus Felix says contamination is a problem, so measuring has to be done very carefully. This is absolutely true. Um, it is hard to tell sometimes, and with DNA evidence, this has been an issue that's often come up, sometimes also with means of dating through through various forms, that sometimes these ancient artifacts have been handled so much that they are corrupted with modern admixtures that will screw up the carbon dating or the DNA, um, because you get the wrong piece, so to speak. You get the modern piece that um, is kind of added on the outside by people handling it, rather than the actual piece from the artifact. And this is something I think that researchers are very careful of these days. But when you read something like the ancient mummy who supposedly um, has traces of cocaine on it, there's a big question of whether the ancient mummy was in possession of cocaine, or whether one of the museum attendants who have handled it over the years was in possession of the cocaine. I do not think that one thing could exactly lead us to believe there was an ancient cocaine cartel operating between the old and new world, um, just by itself. A single example seems to me more an example of contamination. But these are some of the things that you think about with archaeology, and there are certainly a number of unanswered questions, but I do think we need to be careful in how we try to answer them. So with that, I see we've come to the end of our half hour. Tomorrow, I'll be joined by by my guest, Chris Copeland, and we'll be talking about what is coming from Corellian Publishing. I think you'll find some interesting news. Um, and Lepus Felix says paper bills are fun too, just seeing what stuff gets stuck on those paper fibers. I can imagine that's very true. So let us close with our prayer, as we always do. And Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, as we look at this world of many unanswered questions and lovely mythological and spiritual creatures, let us always be practical in how we associate our relation to them. Let us take the good and carry it forward with us, and let us have positive experiences. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and thanks, and knowing you're always with us. But from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. May you be blessed now and always, and I'll see you again tomorrow.